Welcome back. It turns out the polls were right. Donald Trump sailed to victory in New Hampshire's GOP primary, while Bernie Sanders posted a better-than-expected 20-point-plus win over Hillary Clinton among Democrats. Now the terrain shifts to states with very different demographics than Iowa and New Hampshire. Politico's Steve Shepard is on deck, but first, Chief Political Correspondent Scott Thuman filed this report from Manchester.
We have sent the message that will echo from Wall Street to Washington, from Maine to California.
Thank you, New Hampshire. Thank you. We are going now to South Carolina. We're going to win in South Carolina.
No surprises at the top in New Hampshire, with the vote count following predictions for a victorious Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. But perhaps the biggest question of the night was how the rest of the GOP field would line up.
I wanted to congratulate the other candidates, okay? Now that I got that over with.
John Kasich put all his political might into the state, and it paid off with a second-place finish.
Maybe, just maybe, we're turning the page on a dark part of American politics, because tonight the light overcame the darkness of negative campaigning.
Iowa caucus winner Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, who enjoyed a post-Iowa surge in the polls, finished after Trump and Kasich in a close 3-4-5 with Jeb Bush. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton, who was walloped by Sanders, is looking to shake it off before the next Democratic contest in Nevada.
I still love New Hampshire, and I always will. We're going to fight for every vote in every state.
And that means that the focus will now shift to South Carolina and Nevada. But before that, Milwaukee. That is where Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton will go head-to-head in the next Democratic debate. And we'll be there to cover it all for you and bring you the latest from the campaign trail. In Manchester, New Hampshire, I'm Scott Thuman.
Thank you, Scott. Joining us now, Politico's campaigns and elections editor, Steve Shepard. Steve, welcome back. Good to have you here.
Always good to be here.
It was one of the big questions going into New Hampshire. Could Donald Trump, a candidate relying more than normal on personality and a lot of other things, could he do well without necessarily doing as much of the retail campaigning that is typically the recipe for success in these small early states?
No, look, Donald Trump did a lot of big rallies, a lot of big crowds, a lot of TV appearances, and not as many of the town hall meetings, not as many of the diner stops, though he did some that you associate with campaigning in the New Hampshire primary. You know, it paid off to some degree. He got 35% of the vote, it looks like. I finished easily in first place, you know, almost 20 points clear of anybody else. Whether he can replicate that now, look, you know, the states that we have to come, we have 10 days until South Carolina, then there's only 2 or 3 days until Nevada. Then on March 1st, we are voting in almost a dozen states. And you can't be everywhere at once. You can't do that retail campaigning. You have to be able to do those big events, those big TV appearances to get your name and your message out there. He's already proven adept at doing that. The question is, can he survive the next 10 days, that gauntlet in South Carolina, where the electorate is different from Iowa and New Hampshire? It's sort of a blend of the two. Can he emerge on top? You've got Ted Cruz in the conservative lane, and then you've got the establishment Republicans fighting it out, and then there's Trump.
For quite some time now, John Kasich has been the guy way over on one side of the stage. And of course, that is a reflection of the polling, because the top polling candidates are always in the center, usually Trump, flanked by, I guess, Cruz on one side, Rubio on another, whatever. And then the guys and the gals who are really low in the polling get pushed out to the flanks. John Kasich has been different on policy. He's been different in tone, and he's been like teetering at the edge of the stage. Like, go any lower and suddenly you're in the happy hour debate. You're not on the main stage, you're in that other debate that no one wants to be part of. This guy comes semi out of nowhere to grab second place. And the thinking today is, or the question today is, what does this mean? Can he build on what is undeniably fresh and new and momentum for John Kasich?
Right. He would have been off of the stage if not for the fact that they've been taking into account his standing in New Hampshire. He has bet his entire campaign on New Hampshire. He doesn't have much of an campaign infrastructure outside of New Hampshire, which means he goes into South Carolina at that 1 or 2% in the polls. In the next 10 days, can he build on his 16% showing in New Hampshire to surge ahead of Jeb Bush and ahead of Marco Rubio to challenge Trump and Cruz among the more conservative voters? That is John Kasich's challenge. It's going to be very, very difficult. He needs to raise a lot of money and fast to be able to get his message out there, because he is different in policy, but more importantly, he's different in tone. He's not the same. Voters won't hear the same things from him that they hear from Donald Trump and Ted Cruz.
With a proven ability to get votes in one of the states that will matter most as we pivot
on
months from now.
On March 15th, but he has to make it there.
Of course. But thinking long term, to the purple states, the battleground states, right. John Kasich poised to make a case for his vote-getting history.
Very popular in Ohio in a way some of the other candidates aren't in their home states.
Chief political correspondent Scott Thuman joins us now. He's literally on the campaign trail. He is on the move. Scott, it's great having you with us. I know you got next to no sleep last night. Let's talk with you about Marco Rubio. For a couple of days, his campaign tried to deny that what happened on the debate stage Saturday night was more than a blip. Most of the political world believes it was big, and Rubio is signaling now that he understands that that was a damaging performance.
Yeah, I don't know how he can't, Bruce. It's interesting because Marco Rubio was suddenly the big story out of Iowa, right? I mean, he had that great third-place showing, just a 1.5 points behind Donald Trump. So suddenly we had all this chatter that perhaps someone who was not as anti-establishment, was perhaps a little more electable among moderate Republicans, was in the picture, or not just in the picture, but could potentially catapult himself to the top of the first or second contest. Now, what we're seeing with Marco Rubio is what we see with candidates all of the time. They're hot for a minute, they get attacked by everyone else, and suddenly they realize it's not so easy being in the crosshairs. And Marco Rubio has been blaming the media for much of this. He continues to say, well, the media is the only one that seems to care about the fact that I repeat myself, or that I have what critics are calling canned speeches. But listen, it was Chris Christie who first pointed it out, Jeb Bush who jumped on it, and Trump who continued to pound away. So what we saw in New Hampshire was very interesting. There were people actually outside of precincts who were dressed as robots, saying they were a Rubio robot, and they really wanted to kind of box him in as someone who was just a typical Washington, D.C. politician. Whether or not that's true almost doesn't matter, because now the perception is out there. It could be fleeting. Next week we could be talking about someone else. It might be John Kasich who gets attacked next. Who knows? But for the moment, it certainly hurt Rubio. He can rebound, but it's an unfortunate mishap for him on this campaign trail.
Ted Cruz spent hardly any money at all in New Hampshire and did pretty well, all things considered. Jeb Bush gets new life out of New Hampshire. And for these candidates going forward, Scott, the terrain gets a bit more favorable, it would seem.
Yeah, you head to the South where Ted Cruz has some evangelical support and some social conservative supporters. And, of course, Jeb Bush, while he certainly wasn't polling well early on in Florida, he is, of course, a two-term governor there. He is well known. And perhaps some of the voters in the South and what people are calling the SEC primaries are going to look at their potential lineup now, and they're going to say, you know, maybe a guy like Jeb isn't someone we should ignore. Ted Cruz is going to continue to do well. He has a really good ground game in a lot of states, even though, as you pointed out, he didn't work terribly hard here in New Hampshire to try and win. He was banking on kind of some inherent momentum. And then, you know, look at what happened here last night in New Hampshire with John Kasich. Now, granted, I think you guys pointed out just a minute ago, it's not like he's got a tremendous infrastructure around the country. But what's interesting is the Trump people were probably thrilled that it was John Kasich who came in second, because it wasn't Marco Rubio, it wasn't Ted Cruz, and that just stalls their momentum just a tiny bit.
Talking with our chief political correspondent, Scott Thuman, on the road in New Hampshire. Steve Shepard of Politica. We'll take a break. Back with more News Talk on air and online at news8newstalk.com right after this.